As you probably know, the Colby Book Prize honors original book-length scholarship published during the preceding year that most advances our understanding of the 19th century British press. We all know that. We also know that it was endowed in 2006 in memory of Robert and Vineta Colby, distinguished scholars, as we've heard already, and longtime members of RSVP. The committee had a very daunting task this year, examining a number of varied and very impressive contenders for the prize. But I am delighted to introduce the winner for 2022, and this Professor Jennie Batchelor's The Ladies' Magazine, 1770 to 1832, and the Making of Literary History, which is published by Edinburgh University Press. And also, this is really important and very welcome news, it's also available as an open access book, and all you have to do is sign up for any bump that the Edinburgh University Press wants to give you.
It's free.
It's very easy and a terrific development. The committee members praised the book as, quote, focused on recovering the historical and literary importance of a major but understudied magazine title. They said it was a very thorough and substantial piece of archival work, and one that makes an original and convincing case for the importance of the Ladies' Magazine to periodical studies, as well as to the literary history of the era. So Professor Batchelor teaches at the moment at the University of Kent, and her research is focused mainly on women's writing, on authorship and anonymity, on periodicals and book history and material culture. And as of September, she will be moving from Kent to the University of York to take up the role for which my sympathies as the head of the discipline of English. Yeah, right. So please join me in congratulating Jennie, and we will listen very carefully to what she has to say. We will have questions afterwards, if that's all right. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I cannot describe really how honoured I am to be giving the Colby lecture today about my book. As I said to someone earlier, in fact, I've said to more than one person earlier today, when the email arrived in my inbox, it was a very trying day at work I was having. And I saw this subject line, which was RSVP Colby Book Prize 2023. And not really knowing how these things worked, I was just thrilled because I saw the subject line and thought, wow, they're going to invite me to be one of the judges of the prize. I've like made it in periodical studies. And I was so excited, really excited. And then I opened the email, which I had to read, I think, 3 times before it actually sunk in. And I realized that the book had won the prize. I am profoundly grateful to RSVP, not only for considering the work of this romanticist interloper, although the Ladies' Magazine runs well into the 19th century, of course, but for, as we've heard in the meeting just now, for leading the way, as we know, in periodical studies, for providing the conceptual methodological roadmap for the work that we all do, and the all-important financial support as well. So this book, more than any piece I've ever published in my career to date, has been an absolute labour of love. It's a book that I began to think about before I'd finished my PhD, actually. It was that project that first alerted me to the existence of this magazine when in 1999, as a second-year PhD student, I was researching a chapter on fashion coverage in serial publications of the 18th century. It was a PhD on the sartorial politics of 18th century literature. My 18th century is as long as your 19th century is. So it starts in 1690, ends by 1847, but that's a movable feast, right? But in a pre-digital age and at a time when I didn't know at all what to do with periodicals beyond mining them for thematic nuggets, I had absolutely no clue what to do with this extraordinarily seductive, sometimes dizzyingly confusing publication, not to mention how on earth to go about navigating all of the methodological problems that it threw up for me. Now, whenever I outline these methodological challenges, as I often do when I talk about the magazine or some of my other work in related areas, whenever I talk about them at 18th century or Romanticism conferences where I hang out a lot, I'm usually met with looks of mild horror, sometimes sort of audible gasps, but none of the hurdles that I face will faze any of you. But I still feel compelled actually to restate just a few of them here. Largely because the challenges that I faced eventually became, rather than the hurdle to writing the book, they became the subject of the book. So the first challenge that I faced, if I can get this to work, there we go. This is just some of my lovely copies of the magazine in different formats. So the first challenge that I faced, and many of you will have faced, of course, was the size of this periodical's run. So for those of you who don't know it, the Ladies' Magazine launched in August of 1770, and it runs monthly with a supplement issue for most of its run until June of 1832. It then merges with two other periodicals. It merges with a later iteration of the Ladies' Monthly Museum, then titled The Ladies' Museum, and a slightly later version of La Belle Assemblée. So it has a kind of afterlife which takes it through to 1847. And on top of that, for about 18 months in the early 1770s, there are two versions of the Ladies' Magazine, published by rival publishers following a sale of ownership, which landed the magazine in the courtroom, who are vying for the sort of future legitimacy of the periodical. Interestingly enough, they're also being published by publishers who worked right next door to each other. There were literally fisticuffs on the streets about this. I write about it in the book. I'm not going to say more here, but I'm happy to take questions on it. My point here really is that this is quite a long-running periodical, certainly by 18th century standards. By my calculation, it runs to about 45,000 pages of text at any rate. This doesn't include the other contents within it. And it's a scale that checks the enthusiasm of even the most determined. So too do questions of access. No copyright library, this will be familiar to many of you, holds a complete run of this periodical. And a complete, I'm a periodicalist like you, so I'm using the word complete in scare quotes because we know it doesn't exist. A complete digital run was only made available a decade ago via Adam Matthews' database 18th Century Journals 5, which has a complete run. It was published in 2013 and I was consultant editor for this project. And frankly, if I hadn't gone to Adam Matthews and said, I think we should digitize this, and then miraculously they went, yeah, that's a good idea, I wouldn't have been able to write this book. Incidentally, if you ever use this and you see some of the volumes don't say Cambridge or the British Library or other libraries, it just says private collection, that's me. Some of them that are digitised are mine. Another intransigent problem is that unlike its namesake, the Gentleman's Magazine, the Ladies has no editorial or publisher archive of which to speak. The Robinson family, 3 generations of which published the magazine for more than 60 years, before it was taken over by James Page in 1831, was a huge publishing concern. I mean, Robinson was, according to James Raven, the largest wholesale bookseller in Europe at the time. But the publishing house lost almost all of its records in a devastating warehouse fire, a printer's fire, and a succession of publisher and printer bankruptcies in the first decades of the 19th century. These methodological and logistical difficulties are matched by the disciplinary challenges presented by the magazine's unapologetic miscellaneity. So this is not going to be an exhaustive list, but the Ladies' Magazine featured, it's just an excuse for me to show you pretty pictures. It featured fiction. I put that one up there because The Shipwrecks is a source text for Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. It has the title of the novel in its first few lines. It has a Willoughby and a Brandon, and Jane Austen read this periodical. And I just like to tell people that. It had poetry every month. See, there is George Crabbe. His poetic career started in the Ladies' Magazine when he submitted prize-winning entries into its monthly poetry prize competition. It had a variety of essays every month on religious subjects, science, history, education, geography, politics, sometimes in or translated from foreign languages. It had many forms of life writing, biographies, reviews, anecdotes, obituaries. It has advice columns, and it also had news. It's also a multimedia publication, as you'd expect. So it contained monthly song sheets, embroidery patterns for 50 years of its run, fashion plates for over 30, and its entire run is ornamented with embellishments. So these are copper plate, and later when Charles Heath was the editor of the magazine, steel engravings, usually 1 to 3 a month. Frequently, the tone, import, and argument of this eclectic and wide-ranging content collide in frankly disconcerting ways that scholarship, I think, still has an awful lot of work fully to theorise, and that have certainly contributed to a lingering sense in Romantic and 19th century scholarship that this was a magazine that lacked seriousness of purpose. As I'll return to later, despite what we know about the radical leanings of George Robinson, its publisher, and his associates, the magazine's politics can also seem bewilderingly incoherent. Yet even these questions are less baffling than fathoming who on earth provided the periodical's 56 pages of monthly letterpress. The Ladies' Magazine was an enthusiastic participant in that culture of reprinting that, as we all know, was endemic to the periodical trade, and some of its content was, if I can put it this way, because I don't think plagiarism exists in the same way in the Romantic period, right? It was repurposed, shall we say, from already published and not always acknowledged sources. However, a very significant percentage of the original content, a very significant percentage of the magazine's content was original, and for the majority of the periodical's run was the work of a large community of volunteer reader contributors of indeterminate gender. Even when payment for copy was introduced in the 1810s and finally embedded in the 1820s, when the likes of Mary Russell Mitford, Barbara Hoffland, and others are writing for the magazine, the Ladies' Magazine continued to support the culture of pseudonymity, all of which is simply to say the Ladies' Magazine resists pretty much all of the analytical categories of genre, discipline, author, politics, gender, upon which I, as a literary scholar, literary historian, tend to rely, around which the literary history with which I'm familiar has been constructed. But eventually I realised that these challenges were not insurmountable. They were, in fact, the point. One of the key contentions of my book is that the magazine's resistance to the conventional categories, or I would now refer to them as crutches of literary analysis, particularly in the study of Romanticism, is precisely what makes this periodical so very, very important. Reading the Ladies' Magazine, I argue, forces us not only to reread the period of literary history in which it flourished, i.e. sort of Romanticism, if you want to label it, but also to reassess a number of the assumptions that still underpin scholarship on that period, but which were, and this is one of the key contentions of the book, a number of the assumptions that were being challenged creatively and vigorously by the Ladies' Magazine itself at the very moment that those categories were emerging. Like, what is an author? What is an essay? These are things it's arguing about. But it took me a very, very long time to work all of that out. All I had was a hunch that the historic, I'm not going to put that up because it's too juicy and you'll all start reading it. If you've heard me talk about this magazine before, I do apologise. I always bring out Charlotte Bronte, but I'll wheel her out in a second. All I had for a long time was a hunch that the historic neglect of the Ladies' Magazine was unjust and that redress was sorely needed. Much of my work on the periodical in the years between my first encounter with it in the 1990s and the mid-2010s, particularly my collaboration with Adam Matthew, and to the work I conducted with my brilliant former Kent colleague Conrad Klaas and current Kent colleague Dr. Jennie Batchelor for the University of Kent's Leverhulme-funded Ladies' Magazine project, much of that work was devoted to making the magazine's rich and varied contents and its authors accessible to researchers, teachers, and the general public, to give it currency for a new generation of readers. That's why it was also very important to me that the book was published on open access. But I also knew that I wanted any book I wrote about the magazine to move beyond recovery, to make an intervention, if I could, to see what literature, authorship, and literary history in the late 18th and early 19th centuries look like if we view them anew through the lens of one of its most long-running and popular publications. For a very long time, I had many more questions than answers in relation to these topics, but I figured out, I still have a lot of questions, I hasten to add, but I have figured out a few possible answers, and I'm going to share just a few of them with you today. And it's very pleasing to do so under the umbrella of this year's conference theme of currents in the periodical press, a theme that 20 or even 10 years ago, I suspect would not have drawn, if that theme had run then, I don't think it would have resulted in a single paper on the Ladies' Magazine being offered up for that conference. Because for a very long time, the Ladies' Magazine was seen as out of step with or willfully disengaged from the world beyond its pages. No mean feat for a publication that ran from the year that Lord North's ministry was founded to the passing of the Reform Act. According to Mary Poovey in The Proper Lady and the Woman Writer, the Ladies' Magazine differed from the Gentleman's on the grounds that it made only rare references to political events. The ladies, she influentially contended, created, and I'm quoting Poovey here, a reassuring picture of stability and continuity, disrupted only rarely when it considered news items suitable for the polite conversations of female readers. So the periodical's focal point, and Poovey is not alone in arguing this, in fact, she's absolutely characteristic, the periodical's focal point was woman, not the world, and a particularly conservative view of domestic womanhood at that, cultivated as it was by a diet of fashion information, the kind that first drew me to the magazine, of course, moralizing essays, and lowercase r romantic fiction. Now, as I say, Poovey's not alone in making that point, and nor was she the first person to dismiss the ladies' magazine on the grounds of its lack of seriousness. So here you get the juicy quote. One of the magazine's most famous early and extreme critics of the ladies' magazine was not actually Charlotte, but Patrick Bronte. His views on the periodical are captured in a letter written by Charlotte to Hartley Coleridge, which appears as the epigraph for my book, in large part because this opens up so many of the questions that I wanted to argue in the book, and it's just a letter that I'm sure is very familiar to many of you, but I happened across it for a completely unrelated topic I was working on at the time, and I thought, I can now write this book because I now know what this book is about. You may already know this letter, but if you don't, it's great. But some context might be a bit useful. So this is a letter that Charlotte Bronte wrote to Hartley Coleridge on the 10th of December, 1840, and this is 6 years, right, before the publication of poems by Cura Bell, but long after, as we know. Bronte was her scribble mania, as Bramwell put it, was well entrained by this point. She was already a prolific writer of manuscript juvenilia, including imitation magazines, of course, and poetry. And in 1840, she was writing a never-to-be-completed novel called Ashworth, some chapters of which, prior to this letter, she'd sent to Hartley Coleridge under a pseudonym, soliciting his views and advice on the manuscript. And the pseudonym that she used was the initial CT. So Coleridge didn't know who he was writing back to, it seems. What we do know is that Coleridge was deeply unimpressed by Charlotte Bronte's manuscript, and that's putting it very politely. So this letter, which is written in a very playful but also very pointed tone, defends Charlotte is defending her novel in the face of Coleridge's absolutely unforgiving criticism, and asserts her authorial ambition through what Coleridge, I think, must have viewed as a very unexpected precedent: the ladies' magazine. Recalling childhood days reading Derwent Priory, The Abbey, and Ethelinda, though she claimed not to be certain of their titles, when she should have been minding her lessons, Bronte expressed her desire to have existed 40 or 50 years ago when the ladies' magazine was flourishing like a green bay tree. With all my heart, she wrote, I wish I had been born in time to contribute to the ladies' magazine, for then I make no doubt my aspirations after literary fame would have been met with due encouragement. But of course, she wasn't born then. Nor could she revisit the magazine outside her imagination because of the black day her father burnt the copies of the magazine that she owned on the grounds that they contained foolish love stories he didn't want his daughter exposed to. Needless to say, I am quite convinced Patrick Bronte had never, ever read anything in the ladies' magazine, because had he done so, he would have known that the magazine is deeply cynical about love and marriage, and that fiction, which along with fashion is disproportionately emphasised in the small amount of scholarship that existed until a few years ago on the magazine, that fiction and fashion actually occupy a very, very small percentage, often much less than 10% of the ladies' magazine's overall monthly page count. The brine-soaked copies of the ladies' magazine that Bronte recalled reading as a child before her father burnt them were copies that were shipped from Penzance by her mother Maria in 1812 prior to her marriage. They were rescued from a ship which had been wrecked on its journey north. Now, those copies must have included the issues for 1797, so when Maria would have been in her teens. And we know that because each of the magazine fictions that Bronte recalls in this letter, she did absolutely and accurately remember their titles. Derwent Priory, The Abbey is Grassville Abbey, it's a Gothic novel by George Moore, and Ethelinda, which is Athelwold and Ethelinda. Those three serials, they only coincide in that single year of 1797. Now, by 1797, the ladies' magazine had been in the hands of George Robinson and his associates under the sign of Addison's Head, 25 Paternoster Row, for a quarter of a century. Bronte would have known that the ladies' magazine had been hugely successful. that it was one of the most enduring and popular periodicals, with a monthly circulation, we think, of around 10 to 15,000 monthly copies at its height, which in the context of the period I work in, and some of you will work in, but is quite phenomenal. I mean, compare 15,000 a month in 1811 when Sense and Sensibilities published in a standard print run of 750. Yet Bronte knew also that she was writing in a different age, one in which, as her letter indicates, elsewhere, an unflattering appraisal of her talent as a novelist was supposed to be greeted, as she writes, with as much gratitude as if it had been one from Professor Wilson containing a passport to Blackwood. Hers, she knew, was the age of the professional journalist and critic of Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, to which Coleridge was, of course, an occasional contributor, and of dominant personalities like North. Bronte's nostalgic evocation of the ladies' magazine is thus, I think, knowingly double-edged. On the one hand, she seems to be acknowledging how old-fashioned this once popular title had come to seem in a newly professionalised Victorian periodical marketplace that had little regard, she thinks, for the kinds of content and the anonymous scribblers with which the ladies' magazine was associated. But on the other hand, it equally seems to me that she's powerfully conjuring the ladies' magazine as a once tangible but now remote link to two pasts of critical importance to her: the past of her deceased mother, and a literary past that she presents as infinitely more congenial to the pleasures both of female readers and the ambitions of women authors. So Bronte, I think, here is using the ladies' magazine to articulate a barely concealed anger at the literal and metaphorical violence directed at women's reading and writing, both in the form of her father's misreading and pyromaniacal destruction of her own copies of a magazine that bound two generations of women, and in Coleridge's puncturing of her authorial ambitions in his criticism of Ashworth. And of course, Bronte's defiance continued. Though she was not born in time to contribute to the ladies' magazine herself, she reminded readers of the periodical throughout her career. Not only is the ladies' magazine read by Caroline Helston in Shirley, but plots from its fiction and the cultural debates about women's lives, education, and work in which it intervened resurface throughout Bronte's novels. I also write about its influence on Austen in the book too. So one of the central arguments of my book then is that the ladies' magazine, as Bronte intuited, can persuasively write back to a literary history that had marginalised it on the grounds of its popularity, its association with women's writing and reading pleasures. And as I suggested earlier, it can do this precisely because of the magazine's resistance to normative, analytic, or literary historical categories about gender, genre, authorship, period, politics, and so forth. Okay, so for me, this has been quite revelatory in helping me understand why I really don't like being called a romanticist. I now have a reason why, and my reason is the ladies' magazine. But more importantly, I think the magazine forces us to reassess various of the doggedly persistent assumptions that underpin romantic literary history itself. As I seek to demonstrate in the book via discussions of the magazine's diverse, widely read, yet largely forgotten contributors, its extraordinarily diverse contents, its commitment to women's education, and mobilisation of the miscellany format in the service of that cause, the ladies' magazine challenges traditional narratives about, for example, what is an authorial career? What does it look like in this period? What were the reading practices of the time? What genres were popular at particular moments in time? Almost any one of the narratives I've used in classrooms over the last 20 years kind of gets upended if you refract the period through this particular lens. But what I want to focus on in the time I have left today, given the theme of this year's conference, is the magazine's coverage of news and politics, which I discuss at length in the third chapter of the book. And when I was writing the chapter that was going to be about the magazine's contents and thinking, yeah, that's just an impossible task, what on earth am I going to do about that? I very sort of strategically came to the decision after a few months that I really had to make news and politics a central kind of pillar of that chapter, because I wanted to elucidate those aspects of the magazine that had traditionally been considered at furthest remove from it. The fact that the news, this sort of disengagement from the world beyond its pages had for so long been used to sort of been a stick to kind of beat the ladies' magazine with. I wanted to kind of get the stick and kind of do that. Okay, so I might just have a sip of water because this room is quite warm. Okay, news. So, contrary to standard accounts, current affairs were vital concerns of the editors of the Ladies' Magazine. And as Conrad Class demonstrates, its readers were much better informed about ongoing political debates than we have long presumed. As I said earlier, it would be really odd if this were not the case. George Robinson Sr. was well known for what Joellen de Lucia has described as his dangerous and unwavering commitment to radical politics. And as some of you might know, his firm was fined quite significantly for circulating the second part of Paine's Rights of Man, for instance. As the publisher of the Critical Review and the New Annual Register, he and his firm were publicly criticised on many, many occasions by conservative journals, including the Anti-Jacobin Review, for being disaffected to government and enemies to the establishment. Now, the Ladies' Magazine is always conspicuously absent from the list of Robinson publications that is seen in that sort of highly politicised light. But the publishing house's support of Jacobin writers, including William Godwin, Thomas Holcroft, Elizabeth Inchbold, Charlotte Smith, Thomas Paine, and Helen Maria Williams, all of whom appear in the Ladies' Magazine, was widely known. Admittedly, the Ladies' Magazine's politics are far murkier than the other periodicals that Robinson published, or indeed the works that any of those writers published outside it. The magazine's politics is simply just much more confusing than George Robinson's own. In fact, it's often willfully ambiguous. Nevertheless, news, political events, and controversies are much more prominent in the periodical, much more central to its editor's understanding of its female readers' lives and interests than has been acknowledged. So the Ladies' Magazine devoted considerable coverage to the most pressing political debates of its day. The chapter in the book from which I've adapted some of this material begins with a lengthy discussion of the magazine's multi-genre contribution to the abolitionist cause across a variety of genres, particularly poems, essay, news items, and various kinds of Oriental tale. The magazine also covered all of the international conflicts that you might expect it to, including the American Revolution. America kind of moves and migrates between the domestic and foreign news section of the magazine for years, when it's sort of like, well, is it sort of havering about, well, is it still ours? Is it not ours? We're not quite sure. It kind of sort of moves backwards and forwards. It's quite entertaining to watch it. It also covers the French Revolution in great detail, the Napoleonic Wars, and it dwelt at length on various moments of national crisis. Whether in descriptions of these events month by month unfolding in the periodical's dedicated news section, whether in its topical poems or fiction, or in its anecdotes and biographies of public figures, current affairs, and perhaps more crucially, their effects on readers' lives, were recurrent matters of concern. Attempting to establish an editorial position on the more politically diverse of these news items is nonetheless challenging. So in its coverage of the 1790s revolution debates, for example, the periodical affords almost to the millimetre the same amount of space to commentators across political divides, including Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and Mary Wollstonecraft, without giving any kind of obvious precedence to any one of those figures or their ideological positions. My interest in the magazine's presentation of current affairs for the purposes of this talk, however, is not trying to resolve those multiple perspectives, but rather it lies in uncovering the periodical's much more coherent and, I would say, much more sustained political commitment to legitimising what it called, and I'm quoting, the underplot of the grand story. That is to say, where the personal and the political collide, where events and controversies described in its news sections came into contact with the lived experience of civilians who witnessed or were otherwise affected by them. So the magazine provided an outlet for many of the most famous of these writers. So Helen Maria Williams, for example, whose Letters from Revolutionary France many of you might be familiar with, were serialised over many years in the Ladies' Magazine between 1792 and 1796. Other of these sort of famous witnesses that we're familiar from outside the magazine, who nonetheless appear in it, are people like Amelia Opie, whose quite extraordinary retrospective serial travelogue, Reflections of a Visit to Paris in 1802, appeared in the periodical between July 1831 and February 1832. And if anybody wants to try and sustain the argument about Amelia Opie, that sort of familiar argument that, you know, like Wordsworth and a whole bunch of them started off for quite radical and ended up quite conservative, read that text, you can't hold that position any longer. Notably, however, the Ladies' Magazine allocated considerably more space to the views and experiences of subscribers rather than these established literary figures. Indeed, the periodical printed hundreds of contributions in which readers reflected on how matters such as the death of public figures was felt in the home of private families, how the effects of war were felt by those left on the home front. These contributors' stories, essays, and poems reveal the diverse and profound ways that events on the world stage had an impact on the lives of domestic subjects, who in turn, and I find this very important, who in turn critically remediated the magazine's official news coverage. You can't read columns like that in the same way if you read them alongside the other articles in the magazine, I would suggest. The fact that the magazine expected readers to register political events in their contributions, despite ceaseless editorial protestations of their desire to leave politics to the newspapers, is multiply reinforced throughout the periodical's history. Sometimes editors were quite direct about this matter, such as when one of the editors, they're all anonymous, issued a metaphorical wrist slap to a contributor called Bessie Blewett. Now, Bessie Blewett, bless her, she was absolutely oblivious to what was actually going on in the world. So she kept writing very insistently to the ladies' magazine to ask for a recipe for how on earth do you melt butter without flour, right, to stop it from burning. But she was doing this while the Gordon riots were erupting on the streets of London in 1780. So it sort of tells you, like, you have to stop, there's other stuff going on. The magazine devoted considerable column inches over several months to the Gordon riots in a series of articles anonymously written by Thomas Holcroft, just as it did to other moments of national emergency. That's the Gordon riots. That runs for months and months and months. It's very, very, very good. And I should say it's Conrad who worked out that that was by Holcroft. Its coverage of the deaths of Nelson and Princess Charlotte in childbirth were also particularly extensive. Official accounts of these events in the form of news reports, anecdotes, memoirs, obituaries, and engravings that widely circulated, of course, across other periodicals and newspapers were reprinted over many successive issues of the Ladies' Magazine. The Ladies' Magazine also commissioned exclusive items to mark these sombre moments of national mourning. The magazine's 1806 frontispiece, so the one you have here, figures Britannia weeping over Nelson's ashes, while a very affecting 1818 frontispiece imagined the apotheosis of Princess Charlotte and her infant as witnessed by her devastated husband, Prince Leopold. These emotionally charged engravings represent stark departures from the usual allegorical themes and iconography of the periodical's annual engravings. They're very formulaic. They're all variations on a theme. These are very striking departures. Ultimately, though, it was the public's, rather than the official national response to these crises, that was privileged by the magazine. Noontide Walks, a series of meditative excursions authored by long-term Ladies' Magazine contributor James Murray Lacey, meditates upon Nelson in more than one instalment. The walk, published in the 1805 supplement issue, and which immediately followed an extract from Nelson's will that the periodical published, opens with extended thanksgiving for the victory of Trafalgar and its immortal hero. The next month's instalment of his series gives a first-hand account of Nelson's funeral as it was experienced by Lacey, in which he focuses not on the procession itself, which was visualised in various... Have I put a slide of that? Let me see. Yeah, well, yeah, sorry, that was torn, but you know, you get the picture. There were lots of engravings of the actual funeral, but what Lacey does is he turns the optics change. He sort of reverses the gaze, not looking at the procession, but actually to look at the faces of the people around him, of the crowd who attend the funeral, many of whom, in fact, the majority of whom, he says, are women. Lacey was one of dozens of the magazine's contributors who submitted a personal commemoration of Nelson's death. Many of these fellow mourners were women, such as Lydia, whose own account of the funeral procession appeared directly beside Lacey's, and that of Horatia Marina of Coleshill. That's actually a pseudonym of another long-term contributor to the magazine, a very talented poet who died very prematurely of a horrible illness called Mary Dodwell. Not the illness, her. She had hydrocephalus. It was horrible. Anyway, regular contributor Dodwell's poem on Nelson's heroism acknowledges the nation's gratitude and sadness for his sacrifice, but asks it to restrain its grief to support his successor, Cuthbert Collingwood. Now, Collingwood would neither have the opportunity nor, of course, the charisma to rival Nelson in the public imagination. And the magazine continued to indulge readers' appetite for Nelsoniana in the form of prayers, anecdotes, descriptions of his public and private lives, and other tributes for many, many years after his death. By far, I just had to throw this in because it's just so wild, right? By far, the strangest of these is by a contributor who goes by Eusebia, and it's called A Fragment of a Letter to an Inhabitant of the Planet Remote from the Earth of a Superior Race of Beings, which describes Nelson's funeral procession as if through the eyes of an enlightened alien visitor who is baffled by the emotional restraint exhibited by the mourners. That's April 1809, so this is years, right, after the funeral. It's a really curious piece, and I'm fascinated by it. No such detachment is present in subscribers' responses to Princess Charlotte's death. The poetry section, and this is a fashion plate for that issue as well, for mourning dress. There was also mourning embroidery patterns as well, which I have elsewhere. The poetry section of the November 1817 Ladies' Magazine, Charlotte had died on the 6th, was almost entirely given over to expressions of national mourning. Some of these poems, like November by Sea, attempted to raise a paralysed nation's spirits, while Henry Neale's Consolation sought to allay the concerns of other pregnant women who he was worried might fear that they would suffer the same fate as Charlotte and also die in childbirth. In fact, there's a lot of poems, as you would expect, in the magazine around this time about how it's just absolutely fine to keep having children. It isn't going to kill you. She was just unlucky. Other poems dwelt unapologetically on the tragic theme. They registered the grief of the Prince Regent, Thou hast must to bear, and Leopold, to whom not the sweetest sounds of soft condolence can aught avail, as well as the grief felt by every Briton to whom Charlotte is imagined to belong. The royal is described, I mean, you'll know this from your history, but you'll know this also from more recent history of Princess Diana. You know, Charlotte is described constantly in these poems as our princess, Britain's princess, the darling of the nation, and so forth. And this, but I don't want to suggest that this sentiment is entirely self-indulgent. Underlying each of these poems is an acute consciousness of the political ramifications of a domestic tragedy. Charlotte's death is, as one poet puts it, the death of hope, the loss not only of a princess and a future heir to the throne, but of a nation and an empire, the future of which suddenly seemed much less certain. The tragic deaths of Charlotte and her son were felt so keenly, of course, in part because of the stability they offered both to a monarchy beleaguered by ill health and scandals of various kind, and to a nation that had been involved in international conflict or trying to quell domestic unrest since the Ladies' Magazine began publication in 1770. The periodical, and I cannot emphasize this enough, the periodical registers instability at every turn. The world it conjures is fragmented, contingent, unstable. As contingent, fragmented, and unstable as the miscellany format itself. And that connection between the world being like a miscellany, that analogy is one that is frequently and repeatedly used throughout the magazine's history. And I can talk about, I'm not going to talk about it much here, but that idea that, you know, you need a magazine to represent the world because the world is just about as chaotic as a magazine is something I'm completely fascinated by and talk a little bit about in the book. The world of the Ladies' Magazine is one in which fortunes, reputations, and even lives are made or lost in a heartbeat. The most decisive and tragic of these make or break scenes of life is the battlefield, which is as ominous a presence in the magazine's short fiction and poetry as it is in the numerical records of losses that were printed in its news columns. Patriotic accounts, anecdotes, and memoirs of British military and naval success, from prematurely optimistic accounts of Burgoyne's campaigns in America to the battles of Salamanca and Waterloo, sit alongside elegiac reflections on the personal cost of national conflict as it affects readers and their communities. The Ladies' Magazine was particularly invested in exploring the local effects of war on individuals, both on the battlefield and much more often, as I've suggested, on the home front. Epitaphs for, elegies to, and petitions from soldier were very common in the magazine's poetry section. A number of these poems reference particular individuals. I'm just going to have a sip of water. So that's Jane Porter, who many of you might know better as the wonderful novelist, historical novelist, subject of a fantastic new biography along with her sister Anna Maria by Devaney Loza. This is Jane Porter's lines on the death of Lieutenant John Cochrane, a soldier in the 39th Regiment of Foot who was killed during the attack on Guadeloupe in September 1794. Porter's poem, which was published in the February 1795 issue, laments the loss of her lovely friend and seeks consolation for the living left behind. The poem's anger is absolutely palpable. Knowing that Cochrane fell his country's wheel to save is insufficient to assuage the author's grief. So Porter looks to poetry for reparation for this senseless loss. I quote, "The sympathizing sigh my sorrows seek, the heart that weeps to hear another mourn o'er a distant, far distant friend's untimely urn." Ultimately, though, as you progress through the poem, we learn that Porter finds words utterly inadequate to the task for which she attempts to mobilize them. "Cold is the heart," she writes, "which glowed with valor's flame." The cold heart that she's evoking here seems to me to not only to refer to the cold, unbeating heart of the deceased Cochrane, but also to that of the poet herself, immobilized by her friend's death. The warm pride once inspired in her by his military heroism has been cooled by the appalling reality of his sacrifice. As Porter knew, there was a wonderful paper earlier by April, who's somewhere around here, about time lags between memorial poems of different kinds and the significance of those time lags. One of the things that's really important here about when this was submitted and when we know it was written, if we look elsewhere in Porter's biography, is that by the time that Porter had written and submitted this poem to the magazine, which is 3 months after Cochrane's death, she knew that the battered British garrison in Guadeloupe had been forced to capitulate to the French. They'd been forced to leave Guadeloupe. She knew, in other words, by the time she wrote this poem, that his death had been utterly in vain. Porter's poem, while not explicitly anti-war, is representative of a significant body of material in the magazine that emphasised war's human cost and questioned the price of patriotism. Much of this work, much but not all of it poetry, focused not on name figures like Cochrane, but on generic soldier figures from whose viewpoint events are told. For these unknown soldiers, there is even less consolation in valour or death than for Porter. Death holds no answers, for instance, for the eponymous soldier in it's a poet who just goes by G's The Dying Soldier, a Fragment, July 1798, a soldier who expires unable to answer the question with which the poem begins. That question is, "Ah me, why did I wander from my native vale and leave my cottage where contentment smiled?" Like so many of his compatriots in arms, the soldier regrets the guilelessness of youth that led him to be duped into entering what another of the Ladies' Magazine contributors and poets, John Webb, referred to in the Wounded Soldier's Petition as the sanguinary trade of war. Poems like Porter's, G's and Webb's make clear that the kind of heroism for which Nelson was celebrated held no romance, no posthumous glory at all for the ordinary men who sacrificed their lives and the loved ones among them in the magazine's community of readers. I've talked quite a bit about poetry, but I want to just turn in the last couple of minutes to fiction. So much of the magazine's fiction, particularly in the 1800s and 1810s, elaborates on these themes, often meditating in quite unsettling, psychologically very unsettling ways on the effects of war. So take, for instance, a tale such as this, Margaret B's The Young Officer. This was a tale published in 3 parts between May and July 1810. And this is a tale which is structured around, it features a love triangle involving the titular young officer who has recently returned from overseas conflict, Anna, the woman that he loves, and another woman called Ellen, who is tragically infatuated with him. And it's a tale that anatomizes the physical and mental toll of war on its casualties on and off the battlefield. So Edward, the titular soldier, returns from this conflict a remnant, we're told, of his former self. Initially, he cannot be drawn. Everyone's asking him about what's happened. He won't talk about what's happened on the battlefield. But eventually, the persistent questioning forces him to recount his experiences of his troops' attempts to hide from the enemy in sand cots that they dig up and have to breathe through straws in order to keep alive. Sand cots which are then very swiftly and subsequently repurposed as graves for the slaughtered. Now, Edward is understandably absolutely transformed by these horrific experiences, and his subsequent rehabilitation, which is discussed in the story, is understandably difficult. Eventually, he marries Anna, so we get a sort of happy ending. This is what I mean about Patrick Bronte. Had he read this stuff? Good Lord. Eventually, the soldier marries Anna. Ellen, however, dies of a broken heart. The story concludes actually not with an image of conjugal felicity, but with Edward silently weeping by the buried Ellen's grave. Like the sand bunkers come graves by which the former officer's disturbed mind is taunted, the churchyard symbolises both the promise of life and the inevitability of death. The pain and trauma of war, as so many of the magazine's tales verified, are not confined to the battlefield. They travel home. The question of how to live with the reality of war and conflict was most obsessively revisited by Ladies Magazine contributors, often in tales that focus not on soldiers, but on their wives, sisters, and daughters. And I see these very much as, or I try to argue in the book, that they're very much kind of compensatory fictions that contributors penned in order to kind of mitigate the horrors of war through implausibly serendipitous resolutions in which loved ones or those who are loved ones who are believed to be lost or injured are brought back from the brink at the critical moment. So The Reward of Filial Piety, which is a short story that appears in August 1801, might serve as a useful example here. So this is an unsigned story, short tale that follows the effects of the capture and presumed death of a British naval officer in the West Indies, whose wife and daughter subsequently become destitute. The officer's daughter narrowly avoids sexual ruin at the hand of a youth of fortune before the improbably serendipitous surprise arrival of the naval officer, who describes his imprisonment, eventual escape, and the reward of significant prize money that will alleviate the family's financial troubles forever. The plot, of course, is very hackneyed, but it represents a popular type of tale in the magazine that runs really from the mid-1780s onwards, and that's often found in the magazine's opening pages. Other examples include T. Lacey's The Soldier's Return. So that's a story from March 1797, in which a soldier parted from his wife by the necessity of war returns just in time to prevent her from being raped. Or The Distressed Mother, July 1788, in which the wife of a soldier feared dead in the American Revolution finally returns home just in time to prevent his wife from committing suicide. There are lots of these stories. But by far I'm just realised I'm making you really depressed. Why didn't I pick a happier song? I have so many happy things to talk about. Anyway, but I'm going to talk about this one and then I'll try and be happy again. Okay, this to me is the most disturbing variation on the theme I've been alluding to here, which is a story called The Victims of War, A Tale, which appeared in the supplement issue of the magazine for 1803. And this is authored by regular Ladies Magazine contributor Catherine Bremen Yeames, who lived from 1784 to 1817. Her sister Elizabeth Yeames also was a long-term contributor. And I have a whole thing in the book about how I'm fascinated by her sister. I got really upset one day because she disappeared from the magazine and I assumed she died, and I actually cried in my office. And I've never done that before. Not about that kind of work. Other kinds of work, yeah, but not that kind of work. Anyway, I thought she died, and then I was doing some work on ancestry, and then she got married, and I was like, hooray, she didn't die. I was like, well, I hope that was all right. Anyway, she's in the magazine for ages afterwards under her married name. So anyway, that was all good news. Catherine died before her. Anyway, in this tale, an officer is brought back, as in those others, from the brink of captivity and near death, but there is absolutely no vestige of a happy ending here. Nothing to console readers. The tale centres on Claudia Hadlier, who accompanies her naval father on a last voyage to France before his retirement, only for the couple to be kidnapped and imprisoned by French troops. Descriptions of the terror of Claudia's captivity and the sexual threats she endures at the hands of her male captors form the bulk of the tale, which concludes shortly after Claudia takes her own life when threatened by those who have incarcerated her, when she's threatened with permanent separation from her father. So rather than face separation from her father, she kills herself. Her devastated parent is subsequently freed by the horrified captors in a prison exchange so that he can live out his days and live with his grief in, quote, the land of blooming liberty. Unlike The Reward of Filial Piety, there is no narrative compensation to offset the horrors of war, which mark the female body with fatal violence in Yeames's bleak tale. Civilian life for Claudia's devastated father, as for Edward in The Young Officer, is experienced as yet another form of unbearable conflict between gratitude for his own life and despair for the loss of his daughters. And it was a conflict that Yeames was living through herself at the time the tale was published. You won't be able to see the annotation particularly well there, but I'll just explain. That brief paratextual prefatory note to the tale explains that this is inscribed to the author's father, brother, and kinsman, who unfortunately are detained as prisoners of war by the Batavian Republic. Yeames's brother was subsequently released, but Catherine and Elizabeth's father was to remain in captivity for another decade, when in the dire winter of January 1814, he died of fatigue as a prisoner of war being marched between different prisons. In life, as in fiction, there was no happy ending for the Eames family. I'll just say as a footnote that after the death of Peter Eames, their naval officer father, the Ladies' Magazine does something which it only ever does once in its history, which is it tries to raise a subscription for Catherine and Elizabeth Eames to support them, their remaining 4 siblings, which included a profoundly disabled younger brother, in order to support them in their destitution following this dreadful event. Within the pages of the Ladies' Magazine, then, the personal and political regularly collide. In The Victims of War, as in all the poems discussed here today, the news events consigned to the back pages of the Ladies' Magazine meet readers' lives in multiple and often very unsettling ways. Although some of the periodical's content indulgently celebrated figures such as Nelson, many other contributions worried away at these commemorations by depicting war as ungallant and heroism as a far cry from the posturing masculinity that dupes Webb's soldier into the military. Through their meditations on the irreparable physical and psychological damage to those on the front line of conflict and to the loved ones left behind, these contributions interrogate whether war and nation are worth the sacrifices paid in their name. And in the questioning, fictions such as The Victims of War or The Young Officer, poems by the likes of Porter and Webb, reveal the inadequacy of the magazine's official news coverage and supplement and remediate that coverage by registering how the abstractions of news shaped the lived reality of their readers and subscribers. By publishing these contributions, the Ladies' Magazine then, I think, made history's underplots actually one of its central narratives. Although saying as much, I realise, is flying in the face of what's commonly thought of as the magazine, but I think we have to revise this narrative. So, by way of conclusion, I wanted to use the lecture today to address the conference theme, to attempt to persuade you, as I am persuaded, that the Ladies' Magazine was deeply concerned, actually, with politics, current affairs, world events, and their impacts on readers' lives. But I also want to foreground this aspect of the magazine, its determination to centre the underplot, to return to that evocative phrase, because that phrase serves, for me at least, as a rather fitting metaphor actually for the book I've written, which tries to move the Ladies' Magazine from the periphery to the centre of romantic and periodical studies. In that book, I set out to show how attentiveness to the history, contents, and multiple legacies of the Ladies' Magazine offers an alternative literary history of what we commonly refer to as the long romantic period. The excerpted content the periodical determined worthy of preservation, the reader-penned works it published, the genres it encouraged, they do not always, or even often actually, map neatly onto the stories that we've told ourselves about the late 18th and early 19th century literary marketplace. Conventional narratives about the rise and fall of particular genres and shifting literary tastes that structure standard literary histories are revised by study of the Ladies' Magazine, which reveals, for instance, the precocity of the sonnet before Charlotte Smith supposedly revived it, of the Gothic before the heydays of Anne Radcliffe and Matthew Lewis. Volume after volume attests the resilience of epistolary fiction, decades after Burney and Austen have abandoned the form, and to the tenacity of the Oriental tale, the dominance of which, waxes and wanes, but is never really eclipsed during the magazine's run. And it's not just stories about what was being read in the Romantic period that the Ladies' Magazine undermines, but the related questions of who was being read, who was worth reading. The enduring appeal of much earlier, presumed to be forgotten women writers like Eliza Haywood and Della Riviere Manley is confirmed by its contents pages. But to my mind, it's the magazine's hundreds of pseudonymous translators, poets, essayists, memoirists, fiction writers, and so on, who most powerfully disrupt our sense of literary history. The work of these now largely forgotten writers sat in columns alongside excerpts from of the most famed poets, novelists, and essays of their generation, and reached readerships of which many of these more famous writers could only dream to find through volume publication alone. In all of these ways, and in many others documented in the book, I would argue that the Ladies' Magazine puts conventional narratives about romantic literary history under irrevocable strain. The periodical's deviations from normative definitions of genre, reader, and author have been interpreted as signs that the magazine was way out of step with the world beyond its pages. But such perceptions, as I hope to have shown, arise from a very selective reading of the magazine, a very selective vision, perhaps, of what constitutes literature, for which, of course, Blackwood's is a kind of shorthand in Bronte's letter. And we should note a vision of literature that the Ladies' Magazine, as I've suggested, was challenging in the moments of its emergence. So for all Patrick Bronte's fears that the periodical was full of foolish love stories, this book, this talk, I guess, concludes that this was a periodical that was resolutely lowercase r and capital case R unromantic. Thank you.